Thank you very much. I found that very, very interesting, and it backed up, it gave me a great basis for what I thought for a long time, but I couldn't have put a structure underneath it, I have to say. What strikes me is, at the moment, is we're all being told to eat our 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. We're all told to drive carefully, not to drink and drive. There are laws about some of these things. There aren't yet laws about having 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. But we are concerned about the lack of beds in hospitals, and for those sorts of reasons we have to eat certain things, go to school from certain ages. And I cannot understand if the state has to be neutral about something as important as family, when it's not at all neutral about our psychological well-being in other ways, our safety, our bodily health, our diabetes, our cholesterol and all the rest of it. Why is it suddenly that nobody seems to think it's okay to say something about even the upbringing of children by their natural parents, which is actually a human right?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, I think this is partly, this provides, as it were, evidence of or further confirmation of the power of a kind of immanent critique, pointing out the sort of contradictions that characterize certain positions. So, for example, the idea that on the one hand it's not the business of the state to promote or advocate any particular form of social arrangement. So, for example, Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, back on the mainland, he in his the other mainland, he gave a speech in London, in Westminster, just before Christmas, in which he was saying that it's not the state should not be protecting traditional societies. You shouldn't have tax benefits for traditional families. I mean, traditional families and so on, and. But interestingly, I mean, that sounded as if it was saying, look, it's not the business of the state to promote any particular way of living and so on. But of course, in fact, he was arguing that precisely in advocacy of an alternative way of thinking about families, right? Families in which marriage isn't central to family and so on. And he is himself a strong advocate of kind of progressive views about personal relationships and so on, and a strong individual. So I agree that is the case. But the other thing that I would point out, which I think is exceedingly interesting, and for the theologically minded, I will trace it to historical theological position, but I'll do that in a second. But it's just this, it's the displacement of moral activity from one sphere to the other. So for example, when, and this is not so much to do with neutralism, this is to do with this, when issues become ethically difficult, or what I mean is controversial and controverted and so on, the ethical appetite or the ethical imperative doesn't go away, it just displaces itself, right? So people now deploy all of their sort of sense of, moral commitment and outrage from questions of a fundamental sort, let us say, about personal relations, to, as you say, questions of smoking and diet or something of that sort. And I think it's difficult to understand why there should be that degree of moral intensity focused upon these matters unless you see it as a displacement of a more profound moral conviction about deeper matters. So as it were, when you leave the depths and move into the shadows, you don't lose your moral conviction, you just displace it onto increasingly trivial matters. And for those who are theologically minded, just to, I don't know how many of this would resonate with, but I think this is a counterpart of something for which, what it's worth, Catholics are particularly liable, and that is Pelagianism. That is to say, the tendency to displace belief by practice, as it were, to try to think you can work your way to salvation by works. This is the great Calvinist denunciation of Roman Catholicism, that Catholics displace faith with works. But I think that's, whether you think that's true at the theological level, I think it's a very marked feature of society, that as people lose their conviction in an objective moral reality and so on that underpins personal relationships and such like, they don't become, as it were, less morally charged, they become more moralizing with regard to visible, practical matters such as, because that's something you can control, right? How much sugar there is in tomato ketchup, whatever else it may be. So I think it's almost confirmation of this, as it were, swimming in shallow waters, the moral intensification that is attached to these sort of issues, which in the larger scheme of things are pretty trivial.
Sorry. I wonder, Professor Hadlane, would you comment on the current undermining of the very notion of male and female as being sort of given and a very anthropological foundation for a lot of other.
Yes. Well, this is a very interesting issue as well, thank you. I mean, you see, the traditional ethical perspective, sometimes characterized in terms of natural law, for instance, has at its root, as you say, in anthropology, an account of what human beings are. That is, where value is rooted in nature, let's just put it that way, okay? Now, again, Marxism has got a lot to blame for this, but at any rate, though I said, I like certain methods that the Marxists deploy, but I think in general Marxism was a disaster, but that's a different matter. However, one thing that they do is they make an attack on essentialism, right? So they say, look, these categories that you thought of as belonging to nature are really artifices of culture and so on. So for instance, if I try to defend the family, let us say, as being a natural form of human association, somebody who's inspired by this other tradition is going to say, no, you're thinking of the family as natural, but the family is in fact simply an artifact or a product of certain socio-economic arrangements, okay? And that was the sort of thing they did say. And again, the relationships between men and women were subject to the same challenge, that traditional morality saw a kind of complementarity between men and women of a certain kind and so on. And then the critic comes along and says, no, that notion of a complementarity is just an artifact of socioeconomic forces and such like, okay? And now we move to the next thing, which are sexual identities, right? And one critique of traditional morality from this quarter is to say that these understandings of sexual identities are themselves artifacts of certain kind of socioeconomic cultural pressures and so on. So we have to rethink the notion of sexual identities. Now, I think the most interesting locus of that is less the issue, for example, of homosexuality than it is the issue of transgendered sexual identities, for example. Because what's part and parcel of that is the idea that sexual identity resides on a spectrum and, as it were, no place on it is fixed and you can move from one place to another. I mean, that's a slightly crude way of putting it. But, for example, the proposal, which there was some discussion, I can't remember if it was a conversation I was having with somebody yesterday, I know so many conversations, but that you can self-identify your sexual gender. Did we have this conversation? I can't remember somewhere. But anyway, I think the European legislation, prospective legislation, would allow people to self-identify their sexual identity without any reference to their anatomy. That they could simply declare themselves to be male or female and so on. Now, I think this is a very complicated issue, and I don't want to trivialize it. It is a very complicated issue, but I think it is part and parcel of this attack, as it were, on nature. The idea that, as it were, there are facts out there that might ground these values. And that's what I said. This is what happens when a concept becomes contested, that people attack not only the evaluation, but the facticity, the factual basis of things. Sorry. There are several hands here. I think the microphone is going to make its way to you.
That was in the Jakarta principles, wasn't it, that gender could be chosen?
Angela Carter, did you say?
Jakarta.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I don't know. Yes. Sorry, I'm hearing two things coming up at once, yeah.
Thank you. You stated that, as I understood, the United States was the neutral state, and the United Kingdom and Ireland were some years behind, moving towards that neutral state. As one who lived most of my life in the United States, and I returned to Ireland 6 years ago, I actually see that in reverse.
Do you want to say a bit more about that, and then I would say why you think that to be the case? So do you mean that you think that Ireland and the UK are ahead in this respect? Is that what you meant?
As far as the neutral state.
Yeah.
And could you give examples to support your position?
Thank you, yes. This is a complicated matter because what I was really referring to was, as it were, the way of thinking about society or the state that is dominant among, as it were, public intellectuals. So this idea of the neutral state is what is advocated, as it were, by the public intellectuals who shape and fashion and have influence on the changing of policy. Now, the United States, it is true, is very complex for a variety of reasons, but let me just touch on this and see if this is the sort of thing you have in mind. Famously, de Tocqueville, when he visited America and wrote about it, he went formally to investigate the prison systems as they were developing in the 19th century, but he wrote this very famous book, which I like to call What I Saw in America. That's not actually the title of it, but anyway, de Tocqueville's writings on America. He says of the Americans that they're a community of communities. Right? And he says that, and this is, I think there's a lot of truth in this, right? That if you put 3 Americans in a room, he doesn't put it this way, but I'm putting it this way, you know, within 10 minutes they'll have formed a society or a club or a community or a group of some sort or another. They are deeply communal people. I think this is true. And there is also a resistance in the United States to federal government, right? So there's resistance to the state at that level and such like. Now, I mean, there's a long history that would explain why this is, and the Civil War is not unconnected with that. I mean, the American Civil War is not unconnected with that, and the different positions of the southern states and, you know, one thing and another. But American public culture is driven not by Tocquevillian America. It's driven by coastal America. It's driven by the public culture that dominates in Boston, in New York, in Washington, in Los Angeles, and to some degree in San Francisco. And those centers of population are much more conform to the urbanized, industrialized populations that I talked about in the earlier period in the 19th century and so on. So most of America, actually, very interestingly, I mean, from west of the Beltway into Pennsylvania all the way to the California mountains is Middle America. I mean, I don't geographically Middle America, I mean culturally Middle America. It is the America that de Tocqueville saw. But that America is sort of at war with, and this is in a sense what the culture wars in the United States are about, the coastal America, the America of Washington, of Boston, and of New York, of Los Angeles to San Francisco. And those, it's that America, which of course is where the commentariat is. They're the people who make the television programs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Herald Tribune slightly in, let me take my point. Those people are advocates of the neutral state. So I don't know if this addresses your point, but America in its heart is a society of societies. It's much more communal. But America in its public manifestation, in terms of the peoples who shape public policy up on Capitol Hill and such like, is driven by this more neutralist. That's really what I had in mind. Sorry, I'm conscious there were some hands there. Yes?
Professor, do you see a specific movement behind what would appear to be a pagan agenda?
Do you mean, do I detect the smoke of Satan or something? I'm not quite sure where we're going with this one. Do I detect a specific... I don't know the answer to that. No, not particularly. Not obviously and particularly. I mean, that's a deep and difficult question, and I don't have any helpful answer to it, I'm afraid. I would just be glib if I were to say anything.
Hasn't stopped me in the past, but it's only stopped me this occasion.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether this constitutes imminent critique or not.
Yeah.
But I mean, you had mentioned that the notion that one could entirely self-identify in terms of gender is sort of making its way through the commission, let's say, at this point. In parallel with it is a requirement that 40% of non-executive board directors be female.
Well, maybe this is reconcilable, I suppose, if you allow them to self-identify as female. Yeah, no, I realise that. Yeah. Yes, there's a nice sort of tussle there between, as it were, intellectual honesty and a career.
I was planning to eke out my pension and retirement by helping board members identify them.
Right. Yes.
Well, that's a service they might or might not welcome. I don't know. Yes.
So the state is trying to interfere in traditional values, traditional understanding of the family, but the state, really modern state, is made up of individuals, and I guess it's those individuals who have those particular values, right? And they're trying to impose those values on an understanding of family, understanding of society, and so on. So you gave us a hint as to what has gone wrong with the urbanization and industrialization, but it has gone very wrong in the sense that most modern states would have a non-traditional understanding of family, society, marriage, etc. So, two questions, and I think they are related. what has gone so wrong, and what is the common wisdom that modern society evolves towards a liberal understanding of society. That's the normal thing, and to try to counteract that is nearly wrong. But that something has gone wrong, and the question is there anything we can do to put it right?
Well, here's something that's relevant. Look, in the 19th century, in order to vote, in order to be part of the political process in the 19th century, you had, and this is true in the United States as well, by the way, you had to satisfy certain property conditions, and in many places an educational condition. So in order to vote in a general election, for example, or a public election, you had to be of a certain level of educational attainment and to own property. And the great sweep and movement of democracy was to wipe those conditions away, right? The universal suffrage and so on would mean that anybody of a certain age, whatever their educational background, whatever their level of wealth and so on, should be eligible to vote, because after all, that's what justice requires and so on. Now, a number of people who were even advocates of that worried about it. So the great utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, in a letter, I think, speaks of the wise and the otherwise. And Mill was an advocate of democracy, but very uncertain what its fruits would be. He was deeply anxious about the extension of the franchise and so on. And a lot of 19th century liberals, who are quite different from modern day liberals, a lot of 19th century liberals worried about this. Now, in one sense, they needn't have bothered worrying, because in fact, if you look at patterns of voting today, and I'm not going to speak about Ireland, and I'm not going to use the phrase the mainland in any direction whatsoever. Thank you very much. I've learnt my lesson, yeah. But if you look at patterns of voting today, typically what you will see is that there's declining participation in political practice. I mean, in the participation in the electoral and democratic procedures and so on. So in fact, today, people who vote tend to be people who have got a certain educational background and who own property, right? Because what they're concerned about are mortgages, principally, right? They're concerned about the value of their estate, and their estate is their house, basically. So interestingly, we've gone from a position in which we are in which you didn't have a universal democracy, to formerly you did, and one which we don't, right? And the result of that is that, and now this is going to be true in any social setting, what you tend to hear is not, as it were, society in that large and extended sense, but a self-selected small group who have an agenda, whatever that may be at any given time, and so on. So I have questions as to the extent to which society in general actually conforms to the liberals' account of what society is like. Often what they're talking about are themselves, right? And projecting that on. However, I also think that since there is command and control, here's the Marxist thought again, I mean, since there's command and control of the media and so on, and it is command and control. I mean, it is command and control. It is exactly what you would want to do if you wanted to take charge of a society. You'd take charge of its means of communication and so on. Since there is effectively command and control of the medium of intellectual exchange by this sort of liberal, then that promulgates a narrative about society to the wider population and so on. And after a while, this seems to them to be a picture of their own lives. So this is a very deep and difficult and rather profound question. And I do think that, I mean, one thing that's been very interesting since the period of the 1970s, in the 1970s, the big argument politically was not this culture war stuff that's come to the fore. The big argument politically was, broadly speaking, between socialism and free markets. Very broadly speaking, it's much cruder than that, but very broadly speaking. And the free marketeers won. Socialism as a theory of economic justice and so on was defeated, principally by Reagan in the United States and by Margaret Thatcher in Britain. The political victory was won by the right. if you want to call that the right. The cultural victory was won by the left, was won by the cultural critics of society and so on. This is a very interesting situation in which we find ourselves. And a mark of that cultural victory is that the economic right now espouse the very kind of position that the cultural left, and left and right aren't particularly helpful here, but if you take somebody like David Cameron, for example, David Cameron, who it's very difficult to place in this sense, right? So he seems on one hand to be part of a kind of the trajectory of the political right, I mean in one sense a kind of inheritor of Thatcher and one thing and another and so on, but he is an advocate of same-sex marriage, for example, right? And it's inconceivable to David Cameron. I mean, he's not being disingenuous in this. I mean, some commentators think he's just trying to win over the commentariat because he doesn't want to have that criticism on his back and so on. I think he quite genuinely thinks that it's just obvious that justice requires that marriage should be made available and so on. And I think he would think it was quite obvious, one iteration on, that marriage should be made available to polyamorous groups as well, right? So that's the extent to which, as it were, the critique from one side, as it were, has won one kind of victory, while it looked as if, as it were, the radicals were defeated. They were only defeated over questions of economic justice, not over these deeper and much more profound questions about social ethics.
Sorry,
okay, I think we have to finish at this point. It's 9:30. Before we finish, David wants to ask a question.
Just to keep you all here. Just two quick things. You mentioned transsexual rights.
Yeah.
It so happens that Ireland is proposing a law that should come in the next year or two that will essentially give people with male sex organs, if I can put it that way, the right to be officially called women, and vice versa. And this will happen without any debate whatsoever. Okay, there's so many other things to debate, but that's just how extreme things have got, utterly out of sync with reality. Okay, just a quick question. What will the religious freedom implications be of same-sex marriage? Thank you.
Right, well, these are all small questions, aren't they? And right, by the way, I didn't answer the second part of your question, which was what to do about it. Yeah, so sorry. Why did I not answer that? I can't think. So let me sort of link these together in a way. Yes, I mean, again, I'm just going to speak of the situation in the United Kingdom, both north and south of the border. Alex Salmond, the First Minister in Edinburgh of the Scottish Government, gave assurances to Cardinal Keith Patrick O'Brien and now Archbishop of Tartaglia of Glasgow that he would not allow legislation to be passed that would put in peril Catholic schools and principally Catholic schools, but there were other considerations related to that. The fact of the matter, he's simply not in a position to provide those assurances. I mean, he can say it, but he's not in a position to implement or guarantee that. Now, a report was produced on the potential legal implications of a change in the law with regard to marriage, and pretty convincingly, the author of that, who himself, as it happens, is in a civil partnership relationship, argued that under current equalities legislation, Catholic schools simply could not be protected, that they would be vulnerable to action, and not just civil action, but criminal action, for teaching traditional Catholic moral teachings about in sexual matters and so on. And the response to that by, and I think in good conscience, I hope in good conscience, by Alex Salmond, was to say that he would undertake to ensure that the Equalities Act would be changed to protect Catholic schools in this respect. Well, the equalities legislation is not business for it's not a devolved matter, it's a reserved matter for the Westminster Parliament. So he has to persuade David Cameron to change the Equalities Act. I think there's very little chance that David Cameron is going to change equalities legislation to accommodate Catholic schools, or other Christian schools for that matter. The upshot of which is, I think, as with the case of adoption agencies in the United Kingdom, I would say there is now a very serious threat to the future of publicly supported denominational schooling in Scotland. I think that, I mean, my own view and recommendation to, well, actually, I need to be a little bit careful what I say now, but anyway, my own view on the matter is that the Catholic Church would do well now to withdraw from publicly funded schooling and to establish independent schools, and to do so on the basis of a treaty with government in which they would secure the equivalent of 10 years recurrent grant or funding that they're currently given to these schools, and simply establish an independent schooling system in Scotland. Because I think, and I mean what the English bishops choose to do is their own business, but I think that inaction is probably the likely result of this. But I think that in these circumstances, one can have no confidence that in 10 years' time there will not be a fairly sustained and probably effective campaign to bring to an end Catholic schooling, publicly funded Catholic schooling. Now, whether that will happen in Ireland, I haven't a clue, but you can think that one through for yourself. What's to be done about it? Well, I mean, I think that you know, sometimes when people say to me, you know, can you point to an effective movement, you know, of social change in the last 20 or 30 years at one right? It seems to me, you know, the two most obvious ones are the environmental movement, which has made tremendous inroads, you know. I sometimes observe that the practice of, I mean, again, I imagine the same as here, but people who no longer go to church on a Sunday, no longer observe religious rituals, make their way up to the council, sort of whatever these areas are called, where you put all your rubbish and so on, and diligently and religiously separate green bottles, white bottles, and so on. I mean, it is like Deuteronomy. You know, you may not mix green and white and so on, right? So again, this is displaced religious fervour, has now attached itself to that. But that's one movement that's been tremendously successful. I mean, it's co-opted moral and religious sentiment to the ends of sorting glass. But the other movement that I think has been tremendously effective, from which one can learn much, is the gay rights movement. I mean, I think that if you just, you know, look at what they have achieved, it is stunning in terms of efficacy and such like. And, you know, I applaud them for that. I mean, I think that they have worked very cleverly, very effectively, often very sincerely. I disagree with them on matters of substance, but I think they have been a model, and often courageously, a model for fighting for social change. Now, it's not changed in the direction that I favour, but I think that it's no good sort of sitting around and sort of thinking, oh, it's all hell, you know, what's going to be done, it's one thing and another. I think one just has to learn from these social activist groups and try to fight back. But I would have thought, I mean, at the level of community, I would forget the level of the state. I mean, I think that is, but I think the state is going to take care of itself, because I think it's simply not going to survive. I mean, the current levels of welfare states are simply not going to survive the economic collapse that is underway and will get much, much, much worse in Western Europe over the next 15 years, I think.